Welcome, coaches. My name is Stephanie Cowell. I am the Director of Knowledge Translation at Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity. And I lead our projects to improve concussion prevention, recognition, and management across the country, including the publication of the first ever Canadian guideline on concussion in sport. And I've worked with more than 50 national sport bodies, sport, education, and health stakeholders on concussion policies, protocols, and education initiatives. And I'm so pleased to moderate this session with some just incredible colleagues, and also have a chance to answer some of the questions you might have about Rowan's Law, being a coach under Rowan's Law, and the designated person's role. Before we begin, please note that the information provided in this presentation is not legal advice. The information provided is for information purposes only, and stakeholders should seek independent legal advice to understand their legal obligations. Our first speaker today is Dr. Dan Cass. Dr. Cass was the chair of the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee. This committee, comprised of 14 members from healthcare, education, sports organizations, injury prevention, and competitive athletes, was tasked to provide advice to the government on improving concussion prevention and management in Ontario. And they tabled their reports to the Ontario legislature in September 2017. And subsequently, Rowan's Law was passed by the legislature in March 2018. Dr. Cass in 2018 joined Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center as Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Executive. He received his Bachelor's in Science and his MD from the University of Toronto before completing the Royal College Residency Program in Emergency Medicine in Toronto in 1993. He has subsequently held a number of leadership positions, including Deputy Chief Coroner. Dr. Cass is Associate Professor in the Division of Emergency Medicine, Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Dr. Cass.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you for joining today. It's my honor to be able to kick off this session and talk a bit about Rowan's Law, and I want to start by talking a little bit about Rowan. Rowan Stringer was a 17-year-old girl who was a high school student in Nepean, Ontario, just outside of Ottawa. Rowan was an avid athlete, played a number of sports, but was passionate about rugby. And in May of 2013, as the rugby season was starting, Rowan began to practice with her team. She was her high school rugby team's captain, and they began their practices and their initial games. In the week before Rowan's final game, she sustained 2 separate hits, which in retrospect were likely the causes of concussions. Rowan, in fact, thought she had a concussion. When going back after and looking at her browser history and her text to her friends, it was pretty clear that Rowan realized that she had symptoms that were consistent with concussion, but she didn't disclose this to her coach or her teammates or to her family. She hid the fact that she was having symptoms because she wanted to play. So on her final game, she was hit fairly hard. She went down to the turf. She sat up and then slumped backwards unconscious and never regained consciousness after that. She was brought to hospital where she spent a couple of days in the intensive care unit. And then sadly on Mother's Day, 2013, reached criteria for neurologic determination of death or brain death. That led to 3 very important and very selfless decisions on the part of Gord and Kathleen Stringer, Rowan's parents. And I'm proud to call Rowan's parents my friends from the work that we've done together over these past few years. The first decision they made was to donate Rowan's organs because it was something that Rowan would have wanted them to do. So there's people who are living today because of that very selfless gift. The second was to speak publicly about Rowan's story. Gord speaks about how they had received a lot of media attention after Rowan collapsed on the field, and there was a lot of awareness about Rowan's injury, and they really wanted something positive to come from their tragedy. And the third selfless decision they made was they agreed to participate in a coroner's inquest. So a coroner's inquest was held, and the purpose of the coroner's inquest really was to determine if there were any recommendations that might prevent a similar death in future. So there were three main outcomes from the coroner's inquest. The first was confirmation that Rowan had died from a syndrome called second impact syndrome, which simply put is a situation where the brain is injured through a concussion, and then it is re-injured before the initial injury has a chance to heal, and it results in massive brain swelling, which is what happened in Rowan's case. The second finding was that her death was preventable. There were ways that, had her concussion been recognized and appropriately managed, that Rowan could have likely recovered from her concussion and returned to play safely. And the third was the jury made 49 different recommendations aimed at preventing deaths in a similar circumstance. So Rowan's parents realized that coroner's inquest recommendations are just that. They're recommendations. They're not binding. So they were determined that this was not going to be a document that sat on a shelf, that it was going to really translate into action. They went to their local MPP, Lisa MacLeod. Lisa MacLeod, together with all party support from the other two parties, from John Fraser and Catherine Fife, brought into the legislature an all-party bill for the creation of the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee, which I was honored to chair. So there's our motley crew, and really representation from healthcare, education, family members. Gord sat on the committee, sports and injury prevention. And really the mandate of the committee was to take those 49 recommendations from the coroner's inquest and translate them into advice to government on how to make them come alive, how to make them actually get implemented. So, as I said, the mandate was to review those 49 recommendations, but also to look at best practices and legislation and policies from other jurisdictions, to provide advice on how to implement the recommendations, and to make any other recommendations that we felt were appropriate. And then within 1 year to provide a report back to the minister responsible for tourism, culture, and sport, and to table this in the legislature. So our report was tabled a year after the beginning of the committee, and really we structured it in a way that would allow it to be translated across the country. So our fondest hope is that some of the things that have come out of this work and out of Rowan's Law will be able to be implemented in other jurisdictions across Canada. I'm not going to focus on all the 21 recommended actions. I'm just going to talk today about the legislation. So, and I want to point this out because it's easy for us to get cynical about government and how hard it is to get anything done. So we submitted our report in the legislature in September 8th, 2017. The process of drafting legislation, first, second, and third reading, and royal assent took 6 months. So from the time the report was tabled until there was a law was 6 months. And that's, I think, a testament to how important this is, and to the power of the collaboration of parties in government when something can be done in a nonpartisan way. So what's in the legislation? So there's a number of parts of this, and they've come into effect at different times. So there's mandatory concussion education for athletes, parents, guardians, coaches, team trainers, and anyone who presides over a field of play. Codes of conduct for all organized sport, a process for immediate removal from play, a graduated return to learn and play, a Rowan's Law Day that occurs annually on the last Wednesday in September, and an annual public progress report on implementing the 21 recommendations from the committee. And that is meant to continue until all 21 have been implemented. The only part of that which came into effect at that time in 2018 was Rowan's Law Day, and the rest came in by the implementation of regulations subsequently. So the first set of regulations came into effect July 1st, 2019, and they were for the mandatory concussion education and for codes of conduct. And people will be familiar with that. And you know that all of your athletes and parents, if they're under 18, have to participate, as do coaches and others that are involved in both participating in coaching, training, and also in overseeing the field. The first annual progress report was released on Rowan's Law Day 2019. So that was a one-year update on progress towards achieving the 21 recommendations. The next set of regulations were supposed to come into play in July 1st, 2020, but something happened in 2020 that seemed to derail everything. So with the COVID pandemic and a lot of pause of amateur sport, et cetera, there was a delay, and ultimately these were enacted January 1st, 2022. So these really involve the immediate removal from sport and the graduated return to learn and return to sport. So these are the most recently implemented ones, arguably probably the most difficult to implement in a way, because they are very complicated and they do involve a lot of moving parts. But I think these are the ones that when we look back and talk about how Rowan's death might have been prevented, these are the sort of things that might have done that. If there was an immediate removal from sport when she was hit and found to have a concussion or a suspected concussion, and a graduated return to learn and return to sport, that would likely have prevented her death. So where are we today? So all sections of Rowan's Law concussion safety have now been enacted. The full law is in effect. Of the 21 recommended actions from the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee, 18 have either been completed or there's ongoing work. And there's 3 remaining, which require further analysis and action. And these largely focus on the collection and dissemination of data on incidents of removal from play. And I can talk about that more in the questions if there's time. Our Rowan's Law Concussion Working Group, which was set up by the government to continue the work of the advisory committee, continues to meet, and we will until all 21 of the recommendations have been implemented. So thank you very, very much for participating today, and we will go on to the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cass, for that important background and for all the work that you've done and continue to do in this area. Our next speakers are Michelle Kropp and Donald Jackson from Sport Law and Strategy Group. Michelle Kropp began her legal career at a large full-service firm in Toronto, then transitioned to a smaller firm in Stratford, where she enjoyed a diverse general practice. Following a move to the United States for several years, Michelle returned to Ontario and developed a litigation and appellate practice, both as a sole practitioner and in association. She joined Sport Law in 2020. Michelle received an honors Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Waterloo and graduated from law school at University of Western Ontario. Donald, or Donnie, joined Sport Law in 2022 and brings a wide variety of litigation and client experience to his practice as he advises clients across several disciplines, from legal governance to litigation solutions. Donnie has represented and successfully advocated for both individual and institutional clients before the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Donnie graduated law school from the University of Ottawa. Before law school, Donnie obtained an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in criminology from Ontario Tech University. Welcome, Michelle and Donnie.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Just by way of background, Donnie and I we've kind of tag teamed this presentation. Donnie did a lot of the research. I also did some research, obviously. I think what we're going to do is I'll run through the presentation, and then Donnie will probably handle many of the questions if there are any for us. So just by way of background, I'm primarily a litigator. So I see everything when it gets to the very end of the line. So if something does happen, and I have had it happen in the last year, where a sports organization will call me and say, we had an accident last night, or last week, the person had a concussion, they're in the hospital, they're threatening to sue us. So I do get those calls. So we approach this from a very different perspective than, say, Dr. Cass, in that we deal with the legalities of it more so than the physical nature of the concussion. So but I did want to just highlight that when I read the legislation, Rowan's Law, and its associated regulation, I think it's very understandable. I was actually really impressed with the plain language that's used in Rowan's Law, and I think that if you haven't read it, it's probably a good idea to read through it. It is very easy to understand, I think, and maybe Johnny can correct me if I'm wrong there, but it's very simple. It's not, the language is simple. It's straightforward. It's understandable for everybody, which is great. That is very impressive. I also wanted to highlight too, before we get into the slides here, that while of course Rowan's Law focuses on the safety of the athlete, it is also there to protect you as coaches. And whether that's an intended effect or a secondary effect somehow, that is the effect of it. Because if you are compliant with Rowan's Law and something does happen, worst case scenario, if you have complied with all the requirements, that is going to be one of your best defenses going forward if you do get into some legal trouble with that. So on that note, so that takes me to some of the legislation provisions that we wanted to highlight, which applies to you. So this is subsection 4. This is in the very second section of the Act, so which speaks to concussion awareness resources. So as you can read, an organization shall not permit an individual to serve as coach or in any other position unless they give so you guys have to review all of the concussion awareness resources and confirm to your organization that you have done so. And that protects you, gives you better education, and protects your organization as well from legal liability. Again, I'm not going to speak too long on the technicalities and the technical points of Rowan's Law and how the operational procedures go. I believe some of my colleagues today are going to speak more to the real elements of Rowan's Law, but just overview. So the awareness resources must be reviewed by, you'll see here, all participants under 26, parents of participants under 18, coaches, team trainers, officials, managers, and then the approved Government of Ontario resources are online. Oh, and I should say too, the actual law, Rowan's Law, that is actually accessible through e-laws. So if you just Google Rowan's Law, it will take you to e-laws, which will give you access to the law and its regulation. Yeah, so I would highly recommend reviewing those if you haven't already. So with respect to the code of conduct, organizations, this is mandatory, and that's why I've highlighted the word shall. You shall establish a concussion code of conduct that satisfies the requirements set out in the regulations. So the requirements are the minimum that's required to be in there, but the organization must have this in place. And this is who must sign it. So similarly to the other slide, everybody, it's basically the same age groups that this applies to. And you're certainly welcome to use, there is a government template. So I highly recommend using that. That just addresses all of these aspects, it focuses on education and preventing concussions, precautions to avoid that. And the big one is to not hide concussion symptoms. So that's a big one, because in my experience with sport, I also have a sport background. I think that people who have suffered a concussion don't always exercise the best judgment in the moment. So that's where the designated person really becomes important. So here's why we're here today: designated person responsibilities. And I'm sure if any of you are a designated person, you are already aware of this, but just to further expand on that. So zero tolerance is exactly how it sounds. If there is a suspected head injury, the participant must be removed. And this is, of course, a judgment call, but if you have reviewed the concussion awareness resources, that gives you a very good education and background to be able to make that call. And no one expects you to be a physician or act like a physician. The responsibility of the designated person is not to diagnose. And this can be a little bit of a tricky area if the person who's the designated person is also a healthcare practitioner. So that's the lines get a little murky there. So that takes me to my next point, so this last point here, where healthcare professionals. So if you're, say, a nurse practitioner and you're also the designated person, if you're acting in a volunteer capacity and being the designated person, you're still expected to exercise an appropriate level of care. But if you're acting as a volunteer, then the Good Samaritan Act should apply. And what that means is, if you're acting in good faith and you're not negligent, you shouldn't be legally liable if something happens and somebody sues you. And I will expand on duty of care in a little bit, but I do think it's important to highlight, though, if you're a qualified person to make a diagnosis, in the moment, if you're the designated person and you've seen somebody take a hit to the head that could indicate a concussion potentially, act as a designated person, and let somebody different who's also qualified make the required diagnosis. Like, don't do both in the moment is what I'm saying. I know that may be tempting, but without getting into really detailed analysis there, you're acting in different capacities. So you may be covered by different insurances, or however the case may be. Yeah, and then return to sport is basically, it's set out there, and my colleagues will get into that a little more as we go on. So now we can move forward. Thank you. So negligence. There will be accidents. Accidents happen. Negligence only kicks in when a duty of care is owed. You breach that standard of care, there is some harm or loss, and the breach is directly related to the harm or loss. So I know that's a little legalese, so I'll expand on that with my next slides. So for duty of care to be there, there has to be what we call proximity. So you have to be in some kind of contact with the person you owe a duty of care to. So clearly coaches owe a duty of care to their athletes, and clubs owe a duty of care to, well, participants, coaches, anybody under the umbrella of the club. So it's basically anyone who you should know could be affected by your actions. And then, so standard of care is sort of written, it's everywhere, it's all encompassing. So we have these written published standards of care. So you have your code of conduct, you have the legislation, and then there's always the trends, which are unwritten. Common sense, what you should know. When we say ought to know, it's something that reasonable people are expected to know. The case law is intentionally blank because in this case, while we have lots of case law on negligence generally, we don't have really anything on Rowan's law as of yet, because it's very new. But I predict as the years go on, it will start to come out in the case law, and we will start to see that having those signed concussion code of conduct in place is a very big aspect of this, because if you have all of that, then the court will make a pronouncement as to, were you educated? Did you comply with the requirements of the legislation? And that will be a good defense to litigation and liability. So when we talk about standard of care, so negligence is a continuum. So if we eliminated all risk, which is the highest level of care, we would have no sport or activities ever. So that's not really feasible in this space. So we try to minimize the risk. So having the concussion code of conduct, being compliant with Rowan's law, having your waivers, your liability waivers, and assumption of risk, that's all part of your risk management. So we aim to be in the middle there somewhere. If you're exercising a reasonable standard of care, then your risk should be managed. Yes, so again, this is kind of generally speaking, identify the risks. So clearly, high contact sports, that's going to be a lot riskier when it comes to Rowan's law. But even then, there's always risk. So make sure you can measure and evaluate those. What are the chances it will go wrong? Will somebody be hit? What happens if it does go wrong? And then in controlling risks, well, it all goes back to what controls do you have in place to try and minimize those risks. When I say, am I protected by my organization? So you will want to, of course, review any policies that your organization requires you to review and abide by, review the code of conduct, and always follow the procedure and steps that are outlined. Those are there to help you. And so yeah, no competition is so important. It's just not worth it. If anything is suspected to have gone wrong or be wrong, always err on the side of caution. And most importantly, do not rush return to play. Okay, so we had these some questions that we thought might come up. And certainly I've seen this when I did a whole concussion policy suite for an NSO. And across Canada, it presented some interesting challenges because the first question was, how do we deal with Rowan's Law when we're looking at higher levels of competition? So to be clear, Rowan's Law applies in Ontario to competitions held in Ontario. So what happens then when players from organizations outside of Ontario come in and who are not part of an organization here? So when I say certain requirements of Rowan's Law do not apply to organizations playing in Ontario if they're not incorporated here, I mean that those are basically what I would call more the housekeeping, the paper keeping requirements. And Donnie, jump in here if I'm way off base, but I would say that so essentially you don't have to, they don't have to comply with the signed code of conduct. They don't have to make sure they don't register somebody who has not reviewed the concussion resources. All that's basically saying is they don't have to have the paperwork. Rowan's Law still must be respected. So even those players and coaches and everybody who's coming into the competition, you still need to exercise the same duty, the same level of care towards those people as you would anybody else in Ontario. So the substantive requirements still apply. And I think that's it for us. So thank you very much. And I think we move on to the next presenter now.
Thanks so much, Michelle and Donnie. And I'm sure there might be more questions we can get your help to answer as we go. So thanks so much. Our final speaker is Rashawn Edwards, an occupational therapist and interim team lead at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab Hospital Concussion Center. She works with children and families in concussion management, including supporting return to learn, sport, and managing symptoms. Rashawn consults with schools and organizations in implementing evidence-based best practices based on current concussion research. Rashawn also works on the Brain Injury Rehabilitation Unit, supporting children and youth who require rehab support following an acquired brain injury. Welcome, Rashawn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So my role today is kind of to talk about how do we put some of these things that everyone's been talking about into practice. So how do we implement Rowan's Law kind of in the real world, or for you as coaches kind of on the field or on the sidelines? So the first thing that I just want to talk about a little bit, even though Dr. Cass did an amazing introduction, is just kind of what is the law now as of January 1st in the province of Ontario. So under Rowan's Law, all children and youth under the age of 25 who participate in sports will be required to seek a medical assessment for 2 touch points. So the first one is for a medical diagnosis. So that's either a letter that either confirms a positive diagnosis or confirms a negative diagnosis. And the second is medical clearance for unrestricted physical activity. And I'm going to get a little bit into more detail after about what that specifically looks like. But those are kind of the 2 things that you guys need to know in terms of the medical piece that need to happen. So one of the things that I just want to talk about quickly is around prevention. So while we can't completely stop concussions from happening, we do know that there are 3 strategies which can really help us to try and prevent these types of injuries. And I think this kind of partners well with what Michelle was talking about risk. So we know kind of on their own, each of these strategies are important, but in order for them to be most effective, all 3 of these strategies need to be implemented by organizations. So the 3 kind of different ones that we talk about are 1, the use of implementing specific rule changes in sports. So an example of that could be, making a rule that's saying there could be no body checks to the head, as an example. The second is the use of better equipment in whatever sport the person's playing. So just making sure that the appropriate safety equipment is being used for all athletes that are participating. And then the third is educating athletes on proper technique in their respective sports. So we often find that concussions can happen, or there's an increased chance of concussions on teams where the children aren't taught the proper way either to take a check or deliver a check, something like that. Even more important, though, than preventing concussions, and one of kind of our goals and kind of Holland Bloorview's big goal around our education that we do, is that we really want to make sure that while someone's recovering from a concussion, we need to do everything that we can to prevent them from getting another concussion during their recovery period. So the next piece that I just wanted to touch on before I kind of get into the remove protocol is around baseline testing and what the updates are in best practice right now. We get a lot of questions about baseline testing at Bloorview. I think one of the reasons is because we did used to have a baseline testing program in the past, but really what we found was that we were able to provide the same level of excellent concussion care with or without baseline testing. So what we found was that for children and youth especially, it's not recommended to do any sort of baseline testing on them. A couple of the reasons are because children are changing so quickly, and it is very challenging to get an actual accurate baseline on them. Who uses baseline testing? Really, the research is showing it's more for people who are older, so people over 25, and really for these like high level professional athletes. So for the children and youth that we work with, it's not indicated to be beneficial or necessary at this time. So what kind of is the impact to date? It's already kind of been a little while since, almost a year now since the Rowan's Law have been implemented, and there already has been a really large impact on the populations that we work with, even in this short period of time. So here are some examples. So the first one is that we have already seen an increase of 235% in suspected concussions being reported. We also know that now 5 in 7 suspected concussions that were reported by coaches or trainers did actually lead to a diagnosis of a concussion by a physician or a nurse practitioner. And then the third is that we've also seen a 300% increase in players receiving physician clearance after a suspected concussion before returning to full contact play. So just to be clear, the stats aren't saying that we're seeing more concussions. So we don't think that now more concussions are happening. It just means we're getting a lot better at catching them when they do happen. And so all of these really just to say that we're definitely headed in the right direction, which is great to see. So I know you have all, I'm sure, done your concussion education, so I'm not going to go into what is a concussion in detail, but I do find a lot of these points are really helpful when we're talking about recognizing a concussion, because that's one of the steps that I'm going to go through in a second. So a concussion, as everyone knows, is a form of traumatic brain injury induced by biomechanical forces that results in signs and symptoms after a blow to the head or a body. But one of the things that I think is really important is every concussion is different. So one person's experience with a concussion and their recovery are very individualized and very different from someone else. And so we always need to be understanding and trust when someone's saying the signs and symptoms that they're having, or if they're telling us they have a concussion. Also, symptoms may take up to 24 to 48 hours to appear. So that means that just because someone has a blow to the head or to the body and they aren't immediately showing symptoms, that does not mean they don't have a concussion. It can take up to 2 days for these concussion signs to show. We also know that there are some children and youth who don't recognize symptoms. So they might have them, but they're not able to communicate to them of what those are. We find this a lot in younger kids and younger athletes. One, it could be because, they just have different levels of body awareness than we do. And also there can be a lot of adrenaline that's going on when you're kind of in gameplay. And so that's why we always want to make sure that we're really monitoring our athletes for the full 48-hour period. The other piece that I think is still kind of a myth out there is that you only actually need to have one symptom for you to be treated as having a suspected concussion. So even just a headache, that one symptom is enough. And then also concussions cannot be seen on any sort of imaging, so a CT scan or an MRI. So often, you might see an athlete who gets sent for one of these tests. They're not looking for a concussion, they're looking for something more severe and to rule out something else to say that, yes, this is probably a concussion. And then the final piece I just wanted to mention is there has been some stuff in the media where you might see things about like biomarker tests or spit tests that are now being used to diagnose concussion. Just so you know, none of these are being used in clinical practice right now. So it is just based on the reporting as well as the mechanism of injury. Okay, so what do you do when you have an athlete that has a blow to the head or body and there are symptoms present? So this is when you would begin to initiate the removal from sport protocol, and that's the 4 R's. So the first one, and I'm going to go through these in detail, but the 4 R's are recognize, remove, report, and refer. So the first R is there are two kind of steps to recognizing a concussion. The first is that two things have to have occurred. First, the person must be experiencing a sign or a symptom. And like I said, there has to have been some sort of blow to the head or part of the body. So there are three kind of ways to recognize a sign and symptom. The first is self-report. So an athlete themselves is telling you, I feel like blank. And we're going to go through what some of these symptoms look like in a second. The second one is it's observed. So this is something that you as a coach might see. And the third one is peer report. So someone else also might have noticed something about their friend or noticed something about their teammate, and then they report it to you. And so next time we kind of categorize signs of concussion into 4 different symptom categories. So the first one is physical, and this is the one that I would say most people are most aware of. So the headaches, the dizziness, sensitivity to light, those are very, very common, and we hear that a lot. The second one is emotional or behavioral. So those are things like irritability, anger, frustration, sadness. The next one is sleep or sleep disturbances or changes in sleep pattern. And this could be actually sleeping less or sleeping more than typical for the person. And then the fourth is mental. So that's things like fogginess, difficulty thinking, or just feeling generally slowed down, difficulty concentrating. So I just think this is important because there actually are a lot of different signs of a concussion that not everyone is aware of. And it's important to kind of look at it holistically because there's lots of different areas. We also often try and think about is what's the change from baseline? So often, there are days where I often just feel slowed down, but I don't have a concussion. So really it's what's different or changed from what the athlete previously was like? And then also, have they had that impact or blow somewhere to the head or body in recent time? So again, I'm not going to walk through these in detail, but we've already reviewed them, but these are all certain things that could be reported to you around just general concussion symptoms. The ones that I do want to highlight, though, in the next slide are what we call visual or observable symptoms. And this is something that you as a coach might see. So these are ones that I think are really important for you to think about because you actually might see these on the field or in play. So that could be something like an athlete's lying down motionless on the surface. They're slow to get up after a direct or indirect hit. They have disorientation or confusion, a blank or vacant look. They're having balance or gait difficulties. So meaning like they're having challenges walking or looking very uncoordinated, or some sort of facial injury after a head trauma. And just quickly, I did just want to also talk about red flag symptoms. To be clear, these red flag symptoms, these are not a symptom of a concussion. These are symptoms of a more serious brain injury, such as like a brain bleed or a skull fracture. And these are a very different protocol from what the concussion protocol that I'm going to go through. So if you see any of these red flag symptoms, you actually need to call 911 immediately or take the athlete to the nearest emergency department. So the next R is remove. And kind of what is the protocol for this? So who is responsible for the actual removal from sport? And like Michelle had already talked about, it's the designate, which might be you. So the sports identified designate, which it really depends on your organization and what they've decided on who that person is. It could be you as a coach, but it might also be your team trainer. They are the ones who hold the final decision to remove participants with a suspected concussion. Again, that doesn't mean that if you're not the designate, you're not supporting, and doesn't mean you don't need to be educated, you do, but the actual final call is the designate's decision. If there is a doubt whether a concussion has occurred, so let's say you see some signs and symptoms, but they're not very clear, or no one actually saw the actual mechanism of the injury, it's to be assumed that a concussion has potentially occurred. So our mantra is, if in doubt, sit them out. So the designated person is responsible for the following things. So monitoring the participant until their parent or guardian is contacted and has come on site. So the athlete should never be left alone. They also should never drive any sort of motorized vehicle, which might sound silly, but we have actually heard of this happening, especially when you're working with older teens. So someone needs to be with that person. Like Michelle was saying, people who have a concussion don't always have the best insight into what's going on, and they might not be able to take kind of their symptoms as seriously. And so it's really your job to support them, be with them, and monitor them until a parent or guardian is there. The next is reporting a suspected concussion using what's called a removal from play letter. So different organizations have different names for these kinds of letters, and really the name of it doesn't matter. It's basically just a copy of a form that really can talk about what exactly happened, where it happened to, and when it happened. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of these letters after. But this is to be done immediately after the concussion is suspected. So right away, you should be completing a removal from play letter and providing a copy to the athlete, their parent or guardian, and then as well as to your respective organization or your sport club. Some people actually find it very helpful to have copies of these forms on site with them. So they bring them to every game or they bring them to every practice, just that they have them, and it's a great, easy documentation to find. It just is like almost also a great, like, quick little tool that you can look at in terms of figuring out what's to do next. And then the third piece is that the job of the designate is to recommend to the parent or guardian that they seek medical assessment. So a medical assessment must be done by either a medical doctor or a nurse practitioner. We do recommend that you ask your families to take their athlete to the doctor within 24 to 48 hours of the incident, because like I said, that's usually when the symptoms can appear. And this is unless red flag symptoms are present, like I talked about before. If it is that case, then you need to go immediately to the emergency department or immediately call 911. All right, so you've recognized, you've removed them, and now what? So now is when you do some of the reporting that we talked about. So why is it important to use a removal from play letter? You can check with your respective sports organization to what exactly they use or if they do have one. But kind of 4 reasons why it's so important. The first is this letter acts as a catalyst. So this letter really is what starts the concussion policy process. And that is how we can also get our athletes back to return to sport as soon as possible when they're feeling better. The second is recording. So it's keeping a record of the injury. There's so much going on the field or on the ice during play. And then especially when an injury happens, things can get a little chaotic. So we find it really important to right away write down what happened, because most definitely people are going to forget. And the mechanism of injury is really important for the medical assessment. The third is communication. So it's just a helpful way to communicate between the athletes, the parents, coaches like you, trainers, but then also the medical community, so that everyone kind of is on the same page. And then the fourth is for surveillance. So it can really support organizations in being able to collect data and kind of track that over time. And excuse me, I'm going to cough. So refer. So this is the final R. So like I said, we recommend that any child who has suspected concussion goes to see the medical doctor or nurse practitioner as soon as possible. They shouldn't be left alone until they've had their medical assessment, and then it's required that they have either positive or negative concussion diagnosis in order to come back to sports or return to play. Again, this documentation does need to be written down. As well, we get a lot of questions about, are other specialists or other healthcare professionals able to either do the medical assessment or provide documentation to clear them? And the answer is no. So like a neurochiropractor or a physiotherapist who specializes in concussion, or even me, who's an OT who works at concussion clinics, we are not able to do any of this documentation because, first of all, it's really a diagnostic query of whether or not a concussion has occurred, and only a medical doctor or nurse practitioner is qualified to do that. So you have an athlete, they go to the doctor, they get their diagnosis. Now what do you do? So now we start the return to sport process. So this is what a return to sport should look like. There are 6 steps that need to be followed. The first 4 steps do not require medical clearance, so they do not need a doctor's letter in order to get back into this. But the final steps of 5 and 6 do require medical clearance before the athlete's able to return. So I'm just going to go through these just in a little more detail. So step 1 is symptom limited activities. So basically that means is after an initial short period of rest, the athlete's able to start to do any sort of light cognitive or light physical activity as long as their symptoms don't worsen. So when you're going through the steps, what we say is we like the athlete to do 1 step and then monitor their symptoms for 24 hours. If their symptoms haven't gotten any worse, then they're able to move to the next step. If their symptoms do get exacerbated or do worsen or a new symptom comes up, then we ask you to go back to the previous step until, again, they can tolerate it for the 24-hour period. So, like I said, step 1 is kind of just doing gradual reintroduction to simple chores around the house, regular daily activities. Step 2 is increasing to more light aerobic activity. So aerobic activity is anything that will increase your heart rate. And we like to say between like 10 to 20 minutes is what we'd like them to be able to do kind of on a daily basis. So that could be walking, they could go for a stationary cycle, swimming, any of those sorts of things would count for step 2. So step 3 is individual sport specific exercise with no contact. So that could be an activity such as going for a jog, it could be throwing a baseball around, like practicing with one other person, anything like that. So they can start doing those sorts of things as long as there's no body contact and no jarring motions from activities. We also still would like to limit any sort of extra resistance training or weights at this time. Step 4 is, again, increasing the amount of time they're doing and adding in some more challenging activities that are very more sport specific to what they do. So that could be passing drills in soccer or shooting on a net in hockey. Those are some examples. But again, no impact activities. At this point, they are able to also start adding in a little bit of resistance training. So at this point, if the athlete has been able to go all the way to step 4 and after 24 hours they have no symptoms, then we would send them their symptoms aren't exacerbated. That's when we would look into, are they ready to be cleared to go back to full play? So stages 5 and 6 are the only time where athletes need to be what we call symptom free. Before that, it's all just about doing the activities as tolerated. But once they actually are symptom free, that's when we would send them back to the medical clearance appointment. At this appointment, the doctor will be able to say yes or no to them being able to be cleared to go to stage 5 or stage 6, which is when you're adding in full contact to the sport. And we do often say that it's better for the athlete to do a full game practice before they go back into full game play against another team. All right, so I know that was a lot of information. If people have questions kind of after that, I'm happy to answer them. But I'm just going to move on to kind of what the changes are in our recommendations, because there have been some changes. So we really kind of shifted to an active rehabilitation approach when we're looking at return to sport or return to play after a concussion. So really, there have been a lot of changes in the research in what we're seeing, and that really talks to us mainly about rest. So before, you probably heard a lot about, rest until you're symptom free, don't do anything to exacerbate your symptoms, those sorts of things. But what we've really found is that that's actually prolonging the children and youth symptoms. So rest beyond 2 days or any sort of strict limitations or what we call like no rules is no longer recommended. So really, we really encourage our kids that we see and our youth that we see who have this post-concussion to engage in low-risk physical activity as soon as they can while staying below their symptom exacerbation thresholds. So we now know that kind of early physical activity is associated with 5.8 lower odds of experiencing persistent symptoms. So patients who we see who did not do any exercise or were not able to kind of get out of bed, we really just saw that they had a greater odds of having a post-injury headache or greater symptoms at their clinical evaluations. So I know we're not really talking about school here, but return to sport and return to school are very kind of closely linked. And we just know that complete absence from a school environment for more than 1 week is not recommended. So we actually now know that this kind of very strict restrictions on kids and youth can actually put them at a higher risk for secondary issues and contribute to having longer than chronic concussion symptoms. So just so you know, typically what we typically see in terms of recovery is that a typical concussion, the symptoms will last no longer than 4 weeks. So that's kind of the majority of kids that we see. So about 70%, they're back to being symptom-free after 4 weeks. But we do know that there is about 15 to 30% of kids and youth that we see who do have what we call persistent symptoms, and that's lasting longer than 4 weeks. The one thing I just wanted to highlight is, like I said, you're working with athletes, but a lot of them are going to also be going through the return to school process. And while they may be happening at the same time, they also could have different progression timelines. And that actually is a little bit normal. But our recommendation is that all students, before they're cleared to go back to full contact play, should have completed their return to learn process. So that means the kids should be back in school full time. They're able to write tests, write exams without any accommodations before they get cleared to go back to full game play. who may need more support. So we do know that there are certain high risk factors or modifiers that lead some children and youth to be at higher risk for having these prolonged symptoms like I talked about, or the persistent symptoms. And these are the people that we really encourage get referred to go see a sort of multidisciplinary team like the one we have at Holland Bloorview, but there also are many that are out there also in Ontario that might be closer to your region. So the first one is that there's actually a lot of them, and it might seem like this is kind of everyone you see. But the first one is that the age. So 13 to 18 is kind of the age where we see they're at the highest risk for needing kind of increased and more complex supports. The second one is females are also at a higher risk. We're not sure why, but that kind of is what the research has shown us. Also, the duration of recovery from a previous concussion, which people ask about a lot. So if a client's had a concussion and they had persistent symptoms last time, meaning their symptoms lasted for longer than 4 weeks, these are the clients who we know are at higher risk for having another concussion that kind of lasts a longer period of time. We also know that kind of pre-injury factors also play a really large part in a client's recovery. So children and youth who have things like a learning disability or who have a history of anxiety, premorbid mood disorders are all at higher risk for having more complex recovery after. That's the same with if they have a family history of mental health challenges, so their parents have a history of mental health, it also causes them potentially to be at higher risk. We also know that children who have vestibular ocular motor dysfunction, so that's challenges in tracking with their eyes, are also at a higher risk for some of these prolonged symptoms. And then the last piece is we also have found that kind of negative expectations can also cause more distress. So kind of youth that have pessimistic attitudes toward their recovery, we also find their duration of recovery can last longer. So some questions that we get asked about the return or recognizing a concussion is, what if there are no signs or symptoms of a concussion after an incident? So that means that the participant is able to remain in a sport-related activity, but the designate should let the parents know that an incident has occurred and they should be monitored for 24 to 48 hours. So if at this time any symptoms do come up within that 48 hours, then we do recommend them going to get the medical assessment. The next question that we often get is, what if a suspected concussion is not identified immediately? So this does happen. We obviously hope that we're able to minimize these circumstances, but not all concussions are identified immediately for a number of reasons. The designate must ensure their removal from sport protocol, again, after the 48-hour period. What if a suspected concussion happens outside of the activity that you are? So what if it's not on the field or not with your team? So that means that it's actually the responsibility of the participant as well as their parent or guardian to reporting the injury to you. So unfortunately, if they don't tell you, you don't know what's happened. So their parent or guardian or themselves must provide documentation to you that confirms the diagnosis. And then from there, you would go through the return to sport protocol, but a removal from sport letter is not recommended or required at this time because the concussion did not occur during the sport activity that you were actually the coach of. And so I think that is the end of my presentation, just in the nick of time. And I will send it back to Stephanie.
So we did want to remind you of important resources that are available to you, freely available to you, all in English and French. The Coaches Concussion Toolkit is available on the Coaches Association website at coachesontario.ca/concussion. Rowan's Law Concussion Safety website on the Government of Ontario site. All your information is there in terms of accessing the protocol templates, code of conduct templates, the awareness resources, kind of all of the examples and documentation that were discussed here that have been provided by the government are available on that ontario.ca site. You can also find the full legislation and regulations on Ontario e-law. Michelle recommended that everyone take a stab at reviewing that. It's a great place to start to understand it. And finally, of course, a really valuable e-learning resource for you as a coach, NCCP Making Headway in Sport through the CAC. You can access that through the locker, just an excellent learning module that takes you with really relevant coach-specific scenarios. So even if you're not a coach, it's open to take, really a great evidence-based resource.